There is a place on Earth that has swallowed empires whole, not by outmatching them in technology, not by fielding larger armies, not by producing better generals or more sophisticated weapons, by being itself, by being so ancient, so fractured, so indifferent to conquest that every force that has ever entered it, no matter how powerful, has eventually left broken. The British called it the graveyard of empires. The Soviets called it a brotherly neighbor right until the moment it destroyed their army. The Americans called it a nation-building opportunity right until the last helicopter lifted off the roof of the Kabul embassy. 3 superpowers, 1 century, all defeated. This is the story of why. The first thing you need to understand about Afghanistan is that it has never really been one thing. It is not a nation in the way that France is a nation or Japan is a nation. A place with centuries of shared identity, a common language, a unified political culture. Afghanistan is a geography. A brutal, magnificent, merciless geography of mountain ranges that divide the world into isolated valleys, of deserts that kill the unprepared, of passes so narrow that an entire army can be held by a handful of determined men. The Hindu Kush does not merely separate north from south, it separates worlds. Valleys that sit 30 kilometers apart can be completely different civilizations, different languages, different customs, different loyalties, different understandings of who they are and who their enemies are. This is not a weakness. This is the weapon. Every empire that has ever tried to control Afghanistan has made the same mistake. They have tried to control it the way you control a country, by capturing the capital, by installing a government, by building roads and establishing garrisons. What they discovered too late is that the capital does not control Afghanistan. The valleys do, and the valleys do not answer to anyone. The British Empire arrived in Afghanistan in 1839. At this point, Britain controlled roughly a quarter of the Earth's surface, the most powerful navy in human history, the most advanced industrial economy on the planet, an army that had defeated Napoleon, conquered India, and built an empire that literally could not see its own sunset. They marched into Afghanistan with 16,000 soldiers and took Kabul in a matter of weeks. Then they tried to stay. What followed is one of the most catastrophic military disasters in British history. The Afghans who had accepted British occupation began to resist, not as an organized army, as a people. Ambushes in the mountain passes, attacks on supply lines, a grinding, relentless pressure that the British military machine, built for conventional warfare, could not answer. In January 1842, 16,000 British and Indian soldiers began retreating from Kabul toward Jalalabad through the mountain passes in winter. One man reached Jalalabad. His name was William Brydon, a military surgeon. He arrived on a dying horse with sword wounds on his face and hand, barely conscious. The rest, 16,000 soldiers, camp followers, civilians, were gone. The British returned, burned Kabul's bazaar to prove they were not fleeing, and then left anyway. First superpower. Defeated, the British tried again, and again. 3 Anglo-Afghan wars across the 19th and early 20th centuries, each one ending the same way, with Britain controlling Afghanistan's foreign policy on paper, while never controlling the country itself. What the British learned, the lesson they wrote into their military manuals, was that Afghanistan could be raided but never held. You could march in, you could burn things, you could impose a treaty, but the moment your army turned to leave, the mountains would swallow the treaty whole. The second superpower to break itself on Afghanistan arrived in December 1979. The Soviet Union, the largest land empire in human history, 40,000 troops on day one, eventually over 100,000, the most sophisticated military doctrine the communist world had ever produced. They came to support a friendly government that was losing control of its own country. They stayed for 10 years. What the Soviets encountered was something their military doctrine had no category for. The Mujahideen, fighters drawn from across Afghan society, motivated by a combination of nationalism, religion, and a bone-deep refusal to accept foreign rule, did not fight like an army. They fought like Afghanistan, hit and run, disappear into the mountains, strike the supply convoy, vanish before the helicopters arrive, destroy the road, mine the pass, make every meter of Afghan soil cost more than it is worth. The Soviets had tanks. The Mujahideen had terrain. And then, in 1986, the Americans handed the Mujahideen something that changed everything. Stinger missiles, shoulder-fired, heat-seeking, capable of destroying the Soviet helicopter gunships that had been the backbone of their counterinsurgency strategy. The Soviet air advantage, the one thing that had given them tactical superiority, was gone overnight. Helicopters began falling from the sky. Pilots stopped flying low. The ability to rapidly reinforce isolated garrisons disappeared. Without air superiority, the Soviet strategy collapsed. By 1989, the last Soviet troops crossed back over the Amu Darya River into the USSR. 100,000 soldiers, 10 years, 15,000 Soviet dead, over 1 million Afghan dead. And Afghanistan remained unconquered. Second superpower, defeated. But if you are watching this and you think the story ends there, subscribe and stay with me. Because what comes next is the part that no one in power wanted to learn. The third superpower arrived on October 7, 2001.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime.
The United States of America, the most technologically advanced military in human history, precision-guided munitions, satellite surveillance, drone warfare, special operations forces that could call in airstrikes from a laptop on a mountainside. They came for a specific reason: to dismantle Al-Qaeda and destroy the Taliban government that had sheltered them. In that specific, limited objective, they succeeded within weeks. The Taliban government collapsed. Al-Qaeda was scattered. Bin Laden fled to Pakistan. And then America made the same mistake every empire before it had made. It decided to stay, not just to stay, to rebuild, to transform, to create a modern democratic state in a place that had never been a unified modern state in its entire history. 20 years, $2 trillion, 2,400 American lives, over 40,000 Afghan civilian deaths from direct violence alone. And on August 15, 2021, the Taliban walked back into Kabul, not fighting, walking, because the government America had spent 20 years and $2 trillion building, dissolved the moment American support was withdrawn, not because the Afghan people did not want something better, but because a government built on foreign money, foreign troops, and foreign legitimacy cannot survive when the foreigners leave. Third superpower, defeated. So why? Why does Afghanistan defeat empires? Not because Afghans are superhuman warriors, though they are extraordinary fighters. Not because the terrain is impenetrable, though it is among the most difficult on earth. Because of something simpler and harder to defeat than any weapon: identity. Afghanistan is a place where local identity, tribal, ethnic, religious, valley by valley, is so deeply rooted that no external power has ever successfully replaced it with a national identity controlled by outsiders. You can conquer a capital. You cannot conquer a people who do not recognize the capital's authority over them. The British discovered this. The Soviets discovered this. The Americans discovered this. Every empire that enters Afghanistan brings with it an assumption that power, money, and military force can reshape a society to fit an external vision. Afghanistan has answered that assumption the same way for 200 years, with patience, because empires have timelines, budget cycles, political terms, public opinion. Afghanistan has something no empire has ever had: time. Not military superiority, Not political sophistication, not economic power, just time, and the willingness to wait. The mountains of the Hindu Kush are still there. The valleys are still divided. The loyalties are still local. The passes are still narrow. And somewhere in that ancient geography, the lesson that every superpower has refused to learn until it was too late is written in the stone itself. Some places cannot be conquered, not because they are too strong, but because they are too much themselves. And if you want to understand another place where a small force held the line against an empire that should have crushed it, watch our video on the Spartans at Thermopylae, because the story of 300 men in a mountain pass will show you something about that Afghanistan has been proving for 200 years. The link is on screen now.